afternoon to anybody watching. So usually I stick to reels. I limit my stuff to a minute and a half, but I knew that this particular topic was not going to be possible to do that for me. I would probably have to do um, several weeks worth of reels with part one, part two, all the way up to, who knows, like part 30. So I'm trying this longer format thing. I'm going to release this one to YouTube and we'll see how it goes. What do I want to talk about? I want to talk about three terms. I'm going to define them. I'm going to talk about the issues with them. I'm going to talk about the general principles behind them. And they all relate to adaptations of previously existing properties into a new format, or simply retellings that alter things a little bit. Now, who am I to talk about this? Well, oh God, how long has that been? Let's almost 2 decades. I've been going by the name Raining Crow as an artist and illustrator, and I built a lot of my fan base on doing new interpretations of beloved characters. Fan art, okay? That doesn't lend any validity here, okay? I do have a website called Nostalgia Reboot where the entire thing is about new interpretations of beloved characters and stories. But to be real, I haven't updated that website in years. I don't know if it gets any visitors. It doesn't really matter. So that's marker one. The other thing is I am an illustrator and I am a writer. And a lot of my career to this point has been based around adapting previously existing characters and learning the ins and outs of what will please an audience and what will alienate an audience, and where to draw the line between retelling, adaptation, or something new, and how to navigate the public perception of each of those by defining it, by how you define it, let's say. Like, I have a kid's book coming out. It is a retelling. It is a reinterpretation of Cinderella. But because I'm not telling the version of Cinderella that is the most popular in the current understanding of what people define as Cinderella, which would be the Disney Cinderella as retold from the French adaptation of Cinderella. Since I'm not doing that, I'm immediately in the title, Cinder-Ella. Just so people know right up front, this is different. Also, on the cover, making it very clear, I have changed the setting. My version of Cinderella takes place in the Scottish Highlands in the 1600s. There are some changes to the story, but what I did, first and foremost, knowing that I was going to do not my version of Cinderella, is I did deep dive into the story itself. I went back to, oh wow, look at this. There are versions of Cinderella going back to ancient Egypt and ancient Rome and ancient Greece, and they have different names, but they're still essentially Cinderella because certain things have not changed from one retelling to the next, to the next, to the next. There are core tenets that define it as Cinderella. But God, that's thousands of years. How can that be? Every time somebody seems to adapt something these days, they're changing it completely. Well, that introduces the first term I want to talk about. It's called the fairytale paradox. As when a story has been around for a long time, but you look back and it seems like it's not changed from one iteration to the current iteration. It seems like one continuous version was retold repeatedly. And you know what? It was retold repeatedly. But there were so many adaptations, retellings, and variations that changed things over time. Some of those changes stuck, and they became part of how we defined what it was. Some of them didn't. They're popular for a little while, but then the culture decided, we don't need that change. We resonate with these points, and so it appears as the story has stayed static, even though it has undergone change after change after change. Fairytale paradox. Okay. Now, another one of the adaptations that relates to me, I mentioned I write novels, right? So aside from the Cinderella retelling for a younger audience, fully illustrated Cinderella, which I'm still in the process of finishing out the illustration so that I can publish it, I have one that's published already. It's a Frankenstein story. But it's not called Frankenstein. It's not called Frankenstein for a reason. Because while the character is clearly about Frankenstein as a story, the character is not named Frankenstein, and it is not a one-to-one retelling of the events, even a one-to-one retelling of the events from a different perspective. It is an homage to the original Frankenstein, trying to pay respect and honor to everything from the story structure to the intent, the philosophy, and the writer's life, all folded into a new original story that I think that fans of Frankenstein would appreciate. It is not meant to be an adaptation or a retelling of Frankenstein. That's important because, for example, who's ever seen a movie and it was supposed to be a retelling or a reboot, and you watched it and you went, they changed too much. I hate it. Have you ever looked at any of those through the lens of, if they had just given this a different name, I probably would have loved it for sharing a lot of the same things about the story that I loved, and I would have compared it positively. But claiming it to be the same thing is where they screwed up. Ghostbusters. Yeah, there's one version, there's one Ghostbusters that everybody pretty much unilaterally agrees this was not Ghostbusters. You should not have called it Ghostbusters, and I don't really like it. If they had called it something else and not associated it with Ghostbusters, but then the first critic had come out and said, it reminded me of Ghostbusters, I had a good time, man, that movie might have succeeded. Not gonna lie. Okay. Well, how does stuff like that happen? How does Hollywood get it wrong so often? Oh, that's really where it comes down to adaptation syndrome. We'll talk about that later, but to understand adaptation syndrome, you have to understand how we get to adaptation syndrome. And it's something I like to call the Tarzan problem. So you go from the fairy tale paradox to the Tarzan problem. What the hell is the Tarzan problem? Well, okay. Tarzan was wildly successful when it came out. And Hollywood noticed, like, whoa, I think we could make some money if we tell this story and put it on the big screen. And so they did it. But they had to adapt certain things right off the bat. Things like, we don't have the technology to make that realistically happen on screen. Or, decency laws keep us from doing this. But they released an adaptation and it was successful. And so they did it again. And they did it again. And next thing you know, there's a whole bunch of Tarzan movies, then there's theatrical serials, then there's Tarzan TV shows, and we wound up with about 50 years of Tarzan adaptations, where it was popular. But Hollywood started noticing diminishing returns, and kind of in some early market research of what the hell's going on, why are people not wanting to watch this anymore, they heard two answers. One came from one group who were just dying for a faithful adaptation of Tarzan and still wanted to see Tarzan. And they're like, I want to see Tarzan. Can you do it right? And the other group was going, I've seen Tarzan so many times. I am sick of Tarzan. I want to see something different. And what Hollywood seems to have heard, trying to take all consideration into account and please everyone, was, we want to see Tarzan, but we want to see it changed and different. That's the Tarzan problem. And unfortunately, it's led to this thing for where it is satisfied like nobody, all right? They've released versions of Tarzan, and it's like, that is too different. That is not Tarzan. You have not pleased the fans who wanted to see a faithful adaptation. And then they've done these others where it's like, that's not Tarzan as I culturally kind of absorbed it over my lifetime. This is much darker and much heavier. I never read the books. I don't like this. And it wound up that over the past, like 40 years, essentially, Tarzan has not been a bankable character. They tried doing one of them that was a little bit more faithful to the books. It got some critical acclaim, but it wasn't enough of a financial success to merit giving it a sequel. And they're like, well, it bombed. People don't want to see Tarzan. We'll try again in a decade. Decade later, they try again. What do they do? Completely the other end of the spectrum. We're going to do something completely different, wildly different. We're not going to tell you the story that we've told before. And they really hoped it would work, but the problem was it wasn't faithful adaptation, but it also wasn't a good story or a good movie, and it bombed. 10 years later, Disney's version comes out. Now, Disney's got a handle on this. They figured it out early on. But if we put Disney's above the title, people know that it's not the original, and they'll accept the changes because they know it's our version. Disney's Cinderella, Disney's Snow White. Look, they don't look a whole lot like the originals. Matter of fact, for Cinderella, where do you even find the original? You got to go way, way back. There's so many adaptations. Fairytale Paradox, you got some leeway. So they adapted a French retelling. And a lot of people these days is like, did you know in the original Cinderella that it was much darker? And they reference the Grimm's Brothers. And it's like, well, actually, the Grimm's Brothers retelling came after the French retelling that Disney was basing theirs off of. But yeah, I get your point. My first understanding of this, my beginning of understanding for adaptations and the problems that they incur and the pitfalls of trying to adapt something faithfully or changing too much, they really began when I was in elementary school. I had just finished reading The Hunchback of Notre Dame, and I loved it. And I found out, oh, Disney's making Hunchback of Notre Dame. And poor little naive me thought that I was going to get a loyal adaptation of Hunchback of Notre Dame. And then I showed up in theaters, and I sat down, and I was so excited. And I watched that movie, and I was so mad. Because that was not Victor Hugo's Hunchback of Notre Dame. That was Disney's Hunchback of Notre Dame. And the tenets that defined the story for me were sacrificed to appeal to a different audience. That's really when it started. I had to begin understanding the adaptations were going to change things. And like I said, Disney's done a good job of that. But now Disney's adapting their own stuff. So it's an adaptation of an adaptation. And people are going, we want something new. Can't you guys give us something original? And again, Hollywood is hearing, we want you to change the story that we liked because we want something new. Hollywood, that is not what they're saying. That is not what anybody is saying, okay? They want to see what they love, but if they've seen it enough and they feel like they don't need another adaptation, they don't want you to change that into something new and different. They just want you to create something completely original. Quit trying to change the old into the new by adapting things wholesale that people love, unless you're going to give it a new title, okay? Unless you're going to say this is inspired by. This is why Maleficent succeeded and audiences generally positively received it, while the other live action adaptations of your animated work have not done so well, and people are getting really pissed that you keep doing it. As if Disney's listening to my channel. All right, so we've gone through Fairytale Paradox and Tarzan Problem. So this winds up leading to Adaptation Syndrome. And this is when Hollywood tries to make an adaptation and they believe the audiences want them to change things. That's Adaptation Syndrome. Now, I just want to call this out. Good adaptations where they've been really greatly received and respected by the fans. What do they have in common? They were as loyal as they could get. And audiences were able to forgive, okay, I get that you cut that for time. I get that you adjusted this to make it flow a little bit better. But you know what? Y'all did a bang-up job adapting Lord of the Rings that was supposedly impossible to adapt to live action. And Peter Jackson knocked it out of the park. No, Tom Bombadil's not there. No, there weren't elves at Helm's Deep. But you know what? We can forgive those changes because you stuck to all the tenets that we really loved so much that you gave us a mostly faithful adaptation. Another example, Harry Potter. They did not do everything from the books. They changed things here and there. And some of them are, you can nitpick on. It's like, they keep saying that Harry has his mother's eyes, but they're a different color. Okay, well, now you're nitpicking. I get where it might bother you, but they got really close for the most part, and it's generally way better than most of the adaptations we keep getting for stuff. But is that true? We got pretty good adaptations for Hunger Games. We've actually gotten a lot of good adaptations. Here's where you lose the audience. It's not about the nitpicky stuff, all right? It's not about those little things. It's about what mattered and what resonated from the original story that grew the fan base to begin with. Because that's what they want to see. They want to see the story they love. It doesn't mean that you can't do something wildly different and change it up and get a positive response. For example, how about one that is a theatrical adaptation of a book that was a retelling from a different lens? Ella Enchanted. Now, first off, Ella Enchanted the movie deviates greatly from Ella Enchanted the book. But Ella Enchanted the book was a reinterpretation and retelling of Cinderella. A lot of degrees of separation here. The general movie-going audience that watched Ella Enchanted probably didn't know that Ella Enchanted the book existed, and I think for a lot of them, they didn't even know that it was a Cinderella adaptation because it wasn't called Cinderella, it was called Ella Enchanted. A lot of forgiveness happens within that transition. Well-received movie. Not a good adaptation of anything it was supposed to be adapting. Generally just treated as an original thing because it's the first time a lot of people heard that title. Right now, we've got, the Percy Jackson adaptation TV show came out recently. It was a lot more faithful than the movie adaptations, but if you're going blow by blow from the book, yeah, they changed a lot. They did. But it is a mostly faithful adaptation in spirit, with changes that were made to facilitate updates to cultural, social perceptions and ideologies, which, everybody disagrees on whether that should be included or not, but also for storytelling purposes and narrative flow. Some of the changes don't seem necessary, but the writers felt like they would land good. And you know what? The original author was involved in this pretty heavily. So, okay. I enjoyed the show. I did. But no, it's not a one-to-one of the book. Avatar: The Last Airbender. Live-action adaptation put out from a beloved animated series. A series that's not that old. A series that's only been retold in another format one time previously, and it did not live up to what fans wanted, and fans were just going, we want a faithful adaptation. And creators were like, we're going to try to stay faithful to what we think you care about, but we're going to change these other things. And it's had some mixed reactions. I watched it. I'm a big fan of the original. I can see positives and I can see negatives, but I also kind of understand these three terms when it comes to what goes into an adaptation and what the motivations are and looking at it on the long scale. Do I think it'll eventually be retold again with other changes? Yes, I do. I don't know when, but I expect it will, because it's a story that I think will stand the test of time and will become part of our culture, passed forward on and over again. And changes will happen. I'm not a huge fan of the old Frankenstein movies that change things up too much for me because I like the original, and I can always reread the original. I would still love to see a faithful adaptation put to film that stuck to the original, but hey, I'm a writer. I wrote my own version of what I cared about the most and what resonated with me, and hopefully it'll resonate with an audience. What I didn't do is call it the same thing. So, Thank you for attending my little TED Talk here. We're coming up on 20 minutes time. That's a long YouTube video. I don't know if anybody will stick around to watch, but maybe you will. See ya.